Fire format is insane. We have worked endlessly trying to figure out a way to make Dark Magician as viable as possible during this tier 0 domination by Snake Eyes. Over the last few weeks, I've entered a decent amount of events, continuously optimizing the list so that it can combat Snake Eyes. I've definitely gotten a mixed bag of results from XO, X1, X2, and even some lackluster X4 results. All of this was just to find a way to find a working formula for Dark Magician to be able to compete with these fire decks. As I open these OTS entries and winnings, I just want to specify that I'm not yet satisfied with the list that I'm using. In this video, I will be going over the Dark Magician list I did take to locals in my previous video. I do feel like this list can be better, however. Bricking less is definitely a working concern of mine, as is finding a way to get multiple avenues of value from cards that theoretically only do one thing, and I'll get into how that's going to work in the video. If you are a returning viewer to the channel, a lot of these ideas and theories aren't going to be very foreign to you. I've discussed a lot of these ideas before, and I've put it into practice, and I have reasonings as to why I play what I play. There are some changes in this list that I want to go over, but for the most part, this list is relatively similar to the one we built on stream. So we'll just get right into the deck profile. To start the deck profile, we are playing one Dark Magician and one Dark Magician Girl. Now on stream, we did end up cutting the Dark Magician Girl, essentially playing the deck with just the one brick, which is the Dark Magician. And the deck does function very, very well. Now, the idea on stream was that Dark Magician Girl, she would essentially, although her niche situations would help you unclog your hand by giving you a card to access the Dark Magicians off Cartesia or Magician's Rod and Dark Magician Girl with any other spell, allowed you to kind of generate some sort of resources to help push your board and game state further. Now, the thought is okay, if she's the reason why our hand is bricked, then we just cut her outright. And that was the theory I had, a month ago. The theory now, the thought now I have is, if Dark Magician Girl is the reason why our hand is unplayable, then it was unplayable to begin with. And I feel like the draw 2 off Soul Servant is way too strong and warrants playing the extra brick, which I think is the reason why it's very justifiable to play, the one bricks each of the Dark Magician and the Dark Magician Girl. Continuing in the deck profile, we are playing 3 copies of Magician Souls, 2 copies of Magician's Rod, 1 copy of Timaeus the United Dragon, and essentially the thing that ties everything together, the 2 copies of Illusion of Chaos. Now, these monsters are essentially what facilitates a lot of the in-archetype Dark Magician lines of play. Magician's Rod giving you access to Soul Servant and Secrets of Dark Magic, whereas Timaeus is an in-archetype way to make Red Eyes Dark Dragoon. I think these are cards that aren't very strong by today's standards, however are relatively mandatory to play if we are playing a Dark Magician variant. Illusion of Chaos, I hate this card. I don't like how I have to play this card at 2. However, space is relatively tight in this kind of 40 card list, and we have talked about upping it to 45 cards, which then will warrant playing this card at 3 and even some copies of Preparation of Rites. However, the idea with Illusion of Chaos is essentially it gives us 2 extra copies of every single card here, along with the Dark Magician and Dark Magician Girl. So essentially, Illusion of Chaos is the card that gives us access and avenues to facilitate all our Dark Magician lines of play. The most important card in this engine is the 3 copies of Soul Servant, of Magician Souls. Magician Souls gives us access to Dark Magician in grave, on field, as well as allowing Magician Souls to pitch spells and trap cards to draw more cards to dig further into our deck for combo starters and things that can advance our game state. And I think Magician Souls is by far the best main deck option for Dark Magician in its current state. This card is irreplaceable at 3. I know we are playing a limited Dark Magician monster count. However, I do feel like to facilitate everything that the deck needs in terms of Dark Magician and the Dark Magician engine, this is all you need. We do end up finalizing the Dark Magician engine side of things with 2 copies of Soul Servant and 1 copy of Secrets of Dark Magic. Secrets of Dark Magic essentially is a polymerization, a quick play polymerization. It is a ritual spell as well. However, we never go into the ritual summonings unless you go into very awkward lines of play or you're just toying with your opponent. Soul Servant, this card should be at 3. in most other situations. However, in throughout recent testing, I do think that 2 is more than enough. There's very limited situations and limited game states where you are resolving 3 Soul Servants. If those game states are dragging on to a point where you are, yearning to activate the 3rd Soul Servant, I think you lost that game anyways, or you are so far ahead that it doesn't matter whether you had 1 extra Soul Servant or it doesn't. So 2 Soul Servants is more than enough. Now we are playing the 3 targets for Magician's Rod. I do think this is all you kind of relatively need, because you pair Magician's Rod with Dark Magician or Dark Magician Girl in hand. You grab access to secrets to make the Dark Magicians, and the rest of your deck will facilitate value off the Dark Magicians. If you open Rod and Souls or Rod and Illusion of Chaos, Souls and Illusion of Chaos, it is an archetype Dragoon and allowing you to set up an Omni Negate before 5 summons, which does enable the rest of your combos to resolve uninterrupted. I am well aware that I sound like a broken record player, but we are playing Branded Fusion with this list. We're playing the 2 Fallen of Albaz, 3 copies of Branded Fusion, as well as 2 copies of Blazing Cartesia, and 3 copies of Fusion Deployment. Now, the reason for this is essentially, this is Dark Magician with the support we've gotten over the last few months and years, have been predominantly fusion based. Now, this is the best fusion archetype in the game right now. Having access to every fusion monster, every fusion boss monster, which is like Red Eyes Dark Dragoon, Sanctifier, Mirajade, Branded Fusion gives us access to that. In addition, Cartesia Cartesia has actually tremendous synergy with the Dark Magician engine because it works like a pseudo Timaeus the United Dragon. Fusion Deployment gives us access to help us break boards with summoning Fallen of Albaz, or playing through interruptions by summoning Blazing Cartesia. In addition, Fusion Deployment does work like a pseudo Magician Souls. Say you open up Fusion Deployment and Blazing Cartesia. Fusion Deployment does give you access to summon Dark Magician, which is really, really strong and can help you establish your Dark Magician lines of play without necessarily needing a Dark Magician in archetype card, which is why Fusion Deployment I think is very, very strong. I won't dwell on Branded Fusion too much longer. The next engine I do want to talk about is Nadir Servant. We are playing the 2 copies of Nadir Servant along with the 1 Shadal Schism. Now, Shadal Schism does work in synergy with Blazing Cartesia, as Blazing Cartesia is essentially a Winda. In addition, Nadir Servant can also be a Winda in that same type of synergy. However, what Nadir Servant also allows you to do is play through a lot of interruptions, as well as allowing your board to establish a significant overkill. And what that means is a Nadir Servant essentially allows you to set up follow-up. In addition, sets up an interruption on your opponent's turn, which can be very, very strong. Nadir Servant also, if you don't have access to Blazing Cartesia, can allow you to have access to Shadal Schism and essentially window lock your opponent. Window locking your opponent in Fire King Snake Eyes and just pure Snake Eyes format is incredible. I think that is the best counter to that deck, and it's essentially to stop them from special summoning monsters. Now, the biggest question that will come from this is what kind of cards are you going to be playing to supplement with the Nadir Servant package? And by this, I mean, are you playing the Dogmatica package? Are we playing in Quem? I was playing Quem and I was testing Quem. I just didn't feel like Quem was quite amazing. I feel like Quem is very, very strong as a normal summon. In addition, Quem is a fantastic extender off Nadir Servant on your opponent's turn by essentially allowing you to have access to Fallen of Albaz, which I think can be a very suitable interruption on your opponent's turn. However, the things we need Nadir Servant to do in this list is particularly back up a window play. In addition, is to set up a Blazing Cartesia if we don't already have one, because I think Cartesia is significantly more expensive, more valuable in this particular list than Guiding Quem. I think with the way the deck functions, we don't need Quem as an interruption on our opponent's turn, although it's nice. In addition, Quem does get a little bit cloggy if you open it with, for example, a copy like Magician's Rod. We don't want to open up too many normal summons, which does make the deck function very awkwardly. I do think that down the line, if we want, we can cut Magician's Rod for a Guiding Quem, but that is a conversation for another day. Now, the main target we are searching off Nadir Servant when we do send an extra deck monster from the graveyard is going to be Fallen of Albaz. Now, what this essentially allows us to do is replenish Fallen of Albaz to allow us to activate Branded Fusion multiple times if we don't end up shuffling back Fallen of Albaz with a card like Bestial Lubellion, or Lubellion the Branded Dragon. And I think that's kind of all you need Nadir Servant to do. Nadir Servant gets you Fallen of Albaz from graveyard to recycle it, or from deck as an extra card just in your hand to essentially plus, giving you a ability to discard a card for free so that Shaddoll Schism is live essentially. So that's kind of the idea between Nadir Servant and Fallen of Albaz. A lot of people forget that Nadir can search Fallen of Albaz. Although it's not optimal, the only reason why we are playing Nadir in this list is to set up Quem for our opponent's turn if we do need it. In addition, it is to set up a window play. Yeah, so that's it for Nadir Servant. We are going to be moving on from that to essentially be playing 2 copies of Duality. Duality, as many of you know, is one of my favorite cards. We did cut it from 3 to 2. Duality essentially allows you to just play through a lot of interruptions, specifically Imperm and Effect Veiler. In addition, Duality is a 2.5 card combo to set up Dragoon and Winda with Blazing Cartesia, which is, I think, really strong. Duality also late game allows you to banish it to essentially recycle resources and assets to draw a card, and in late game I think that's when Duality very much shines. In my personal opinion, the biggest luxury for a deck to have, especially in a format like the one we're in with Fire format, is to have access to non-engine. Now, the non-engine we are going to be playing in this particular list is going to be 3 copies of Crossout Designator, which does have a lot of value in this particular list. One, by allowing you to essentially play through hand traps, but in addition, there are other niches for Crossout Designator which can help progress your game state forward. Crossout Designator has a lot of very interesting interactions with this particular list. Obviously, its primary focus is to dodge and play through a lot of hand traps by essentially saying no to your opponent. However, Crossout Designator also in a Branded Fusion heavy format that, you know, if you're not playing Fire Kings, you're mostly playing a Runic variant or a branded variant. And Crossout Designator essentially is our main deck option to deal with Branded Fusion and branded decks, right? You set Crossout going into a branded board, they activate Branded Fusion or Cartesia or something along those lines. You can Crossout Designator and essentially nullify that threat. In addition, Crossout Designator is actually very interesting in a hand like this for your list, right? Because Crossout Designator, what it can also do is facilitate Dragoon and as an additional copy of Magician Souls. Now, if you open up a hand like this where you have a dead Soul Servant, we might as well turn Soul Servant into a draw. So what you want to do in this particular instance is essentially activate your copy of Branded Fusion. And if your opponent doesn't have the Ash Blossom, which is the biggest threat in this situation, obviously if you have Cartesia, if one of these cards is Cartesia, you can even you can do this because you're immediately not scared of Imperm. However, if you feel like your opponent isn't playing Imperm or they're on no cards in hand or whatever the case is, Crossout Designator does allow you to give you value off the Soul Servant. So in this situation, if you activate Branded Fusion and your opponent doesn't have the Ash Blossom, what you can do is you can activate Crossout Designator, declaring Dark Magician and banishing it. What this will essentially allow you to do is use Dark Magician as fodder for Branded Fusion. So now, after Crossout Designator is chainlink 2 to Branded Fusion, your Branded Fusion will resolve, sending your copy of Fallen of Albaz and Dark Magician Girl. Now, what this situation will do is essentially it will allow you to summon your copy of Lubellion, and Lubellion will activate its effect. Lubellion can pitch the copy of Soul Servant, shuffling back the Fallen of Albaz and the banished Dark Magician to essentially make your copy of Red Eyes Dark Dragoon. Now, in addition to this, what we immediately just did was we had no access to Dark Magician. We were going to lose a card in our hand, and we essentially have value off the Soul Servant, off the dead Soul Servant, right? If Soul Servant is by itself in the hand, there's no value off Soul Servant. So what we immediately did in this situation is we put Dark Magician Girl in grave. In addition, we use Dark Magician as material for Red Eyes Dark Dragoon, so then we can banish Soul Servant and draw an extra card. And that's kind of the interesting interactions Crossout has in addition to playing through hand traps. This obviously doesn't come up, but I thought it was interesting enough to share as a way to kind of maximize your value of cards. And that's kind of the idea of Dark Magician. We need to figure out how to maximize our cards' values so that they do the most even when they aren't being in use. So that's kind of the situation the thought behind that. We are playing 2 copies of Ash Blossom, 2 copies of Nibiru, and 2 copies of Infinite Impermanence. Now, the reason for this is essentially we are playing kind of like an OCG count. A lot of this deck, believe it or not, does allow you to play through boards with just Engine. With Branded Fusion and the Dark Magician side of things, the Engine does apply a lot of pressure to push through a lot of boards, especially in a format with no Omni Negates. If our opponent does end up hand trapping us, these 3 hand traps are the ones that do hinder our list the most. I don't think Droll and Lockbird is a real hand trap currently. I think Droll and Lockbird is significantly outdated, or significantly outgrew the format, or the format outgrew Droll and Lockbird, and it's gone to a point where a lot of players aren't really playing it. Crossout Designator essentially allows us to play through hand traps like Ash Blossom, like Nibiru. Even though our deck does play through Imperm very, very comfortably with cards like Duality and Blazing Cartesia, the reasoning for Imperm is essentially Imperm is very, very good into other decks. Now, ultimately, we are playing these 6 cards to facilitate Crossout Designator and give it value, so that if we do get hand trapped, Crossout does end up blocking or helping us to essentially negate these hand traps and not worry about them. But in addition, hand traps do help us stop our opponent from playing. We open any combination of these 2 hand traps with, for example, cards like Fusion Deployment and the Dark Magician side of things, or Branded Fusion and the Dark Magician side of things. Our board is going to be pretty substantial. In addition to have these interruptions, it's also fantastic. The last 3 slots in the main deck we are playing is going to be the 2 copies of Triple Tactics Talents and 1 copy of Triple Tactics Thrust. Now, I think these 3 copies can be intertwined. I think you play 2 in 1. It doesn't really matter which one you want to play at 2 and which one you want to play at 1. A lot of people play 2 thrusts, 1 talents. A lot of people play 2 talents, 1 thrust. In my personal opinion, I think there's just a little bit more value with 2 talents, 1 thrust. Why? Because I think it's better going into turn 0. Game 1, turn 0, I think talents, if you're going first, talents is just a little bit stronger than thrust. And in addition, talents also has its very strong applications going first. Thrust is fantastic. Talents also has its implications going second, as does Thrust. Thrust is obviously better going second because it gives you access to talents if you don't have it. In addition, Thrust gives you access to pretty much your entire deck. Now, the point is if you open Thrust going first on game 1 and your opponent does interrupt you, I think talents is just a little bit better in that situation, and that's why I opt to play 2 and 1. Now, the extra deck actually hasn't changed a lot since our live stream. In addition, it actually hasn't changed much over the last few months. We have been playing Branded Dark Magician for. Now, we are playing the 2 copies of Red Eyes Dark Dragoon, as it's essentially the best fusion card in our deck as our boss monster. It's essentially the reason why we play the Dark Magician archetype. We are playing the 1 copy of the Dark Magicians. I don't think this card is amazing. However, it does allow you to generate some sort of resources in the odd chance you open relatively unplayable. Is it good? Not really. However, I do feel like it warrants a main deck slot. In addition, Master of Chaos. I think Master of Chaos in Branded Dark Magician is actually a very, very good option, as it allows you to revive, for example, Dragoon, Cartesias, things like that, and with no Omni Negates. Master of Chaos allowing you to essentially nuke your opponent's board is, I think, very, very strong, especially in fire format. When your opponent opens up full Snake Eyes combo with no Omni Negates, you deal with the Appaloosa, for example. Master of Chaos essentially allowing you to deal with cards like Flameburge and not allowing it to trigger its effect is very, very strong. We are following the deck profile, the extra deck, with 2 copies of Albion the Branded Dragon, as well as 1 Lubellion. Now, these essentially are your fusion monsters from the Branded package, but they go into copy cards like Red Eyes Dark Dragoon or Master of Chaos. We then go into a copy of Mirror Jade as well as Sanctifier. Konami, please ban Sanctifier. I think Sanctifier is such a problematic card. However, while it's still legal, I think we do need to play it. It's a very, very free card. It applies insane amounts of pressure, and it's an absolute menace to deal with. In the grind game, Sanctifier does win games on its own, much like Master of Chaos. We are playing the 1 copy of Grang and Yol and the 1 copy of Lulu Willith. Grang and Yol and Lulu Willith are actually very, very amazing. The reason being is essentially Despia and Lulu Willith allows in synergy with cards like Nadir Servant. Despia and Lulu Willith allows you to access Blazing Cartesia on your opponent's turn. which does open up a whole avenue of interruptions and things like that with Nadir Servant. And for example, you activate Nadir Servant, Despian Lulu-Lilith is sent to the graveyard. If you already have access to, for example, Shaddoll Schism, or you don't feel like Winda is optimal, you can activate Despian Lulu-Lilith, send it to the Nadir Servant, send Lulu-Lilith, grab Fallen of Albaz. In the end phase, Lulu-Lilith summons Cartesia, and then what happens is essentially on your opponent's turn, Cartesia can activate its effect, fusing with the Fallen of Albaz in hand into Albion, and then Albion can make a Mirror Jade on your opponent's turn. So I think that's a really interesting interaction to have Lulu-Lilith. In addition, it also acts as an Omni Negate when you set up Dragoon and Winda with Grang and Yoel and Grave. We do end the deck profile with the 1 copy of Shaddoll Apkallone and 2 copies of El Shaddoll Winda. This is essentially the lock in your the lock on your opponent's turn. These cards are just so unfair, and essentially more than anything in this deck, this is the win condition of the list. It's how you beat Snake Eyes. It's essentially the go-to. They out the 1 Winda, the 2nd Winda you make it on their opponent's turn, or on the crackback. It just applies so much pressure and makes Schism infinitely better when you play 2 Windas. We end the deck profile with 1 SP Little Knight. SP Little Knight is in the odd chance that you don't open up Branded Fusion or Fusion Deployment, or aren't locked into fusion monsters. If, for example, you open up Rod, Magician Souls, and Nadir Servant, and your opponent does interrupt you on your Rod and Magician Souls line of play, or somewhere along those lines, you can just make SP Little Knight, and SP Little Knight is essentially a free interruption on your opponent's turn that is very, very hard to deal with. That's it for the extra deck. It's relatively standard for what we have going for it. I think that it offers a lot in a lot of different avenues. The side deck is one of the most important aspects of Yu-Gi-Oh! And it's my favorite aspect of Yu-Gi-Oh! Just giving you your deck the ability to combat whatever decks you're going up against. So we are starting the side deck with the Bestial count. We are playing the 1 Mag, the 1 Druis, and the 1 Boldrake. The main reason for this is I feel Branded is fantastic. Is a fantastic pick for right now if you aren't playing the expensive Snake Eyes list. In addition, although they do stop Branded, in addition they stop Voiceless Voice very, very well. These cards I think are the best counter for Voiceless Voice, and I think they are relatively mandatory to play, especially in side deck play. The next engine we are playing in our side deck is the Shaddoll package. We are playing Shaddoll Dragon, Shaddoll Ariel, and 3 copies of Shaddoll Fusion. Now, what these cards allow us to do is essentially play into any board with no Omni Negates. This engine in particular deals with Snake Eyes and Fire King Snake Eyes more specifically very, very well. You see Shaddoll Fusion into a Fire King Snake Eyes board, it's an FTK, and I'll go into why in a second. We follow out the deck profile with cards that you kind of need to play. So we do play the 3 copies of Cosmic Cyclone. There's a lot of floodgates right now with like anti-spell or summon limit. Cosmic Cyclone is just really, really free, really, really generic. Cosmic Cyclone also banish the Fire King Island if they are playing the Snake Eyes variant. In addition, there are some runic stun variants running around right now, and I think Cosmic Cyclone is very, very good for that. Cosmic Cyclone just dealing with the runic fountain puts you so far ahead into any sort of runic matchup if that is the game you are going to be playing. In addition, we are playing 3 copies of Secret Village and 1 copy of Metaverse as essentially a thrust target. So we are going first into whatever board, if we are playing like Fluon versus Fluanderize, or reversing Snake Eyes. I know Snake Eyes do play Diabellstar, but with Village you do put them on. You better have Diabellstar in hand or you just can't play, and I think Village is very strong for that interaction. And in a fire heavy format with Metaverse in the deck, we are playing essentially 6 copies of this because you can thrust into Metaverse if you are going first into game 2, game 3. I think thrust, you want to keep 1 thrust in the deck, and essentially you're siding in these so that if you do get hand trapped, thrust searches you Metaverse, which searches you Village. And essentially the reason why we're playing Metaverse instead of terraforming is essentially for that reason specifically. So that's it for the deck profile. It has done very, very well so far. I do feel like the deck does need some sort of revision, and once I figure out the most optimal way to play the list, I'll for sure give an update. For the time being, I want to thank everyone for watching and have a wonderful, wonderful day.